I hope you're ready, Ultrawide fans, because I have more GPUs and more resolutions than any other Starfield performance video out there. I have 7 GPUs here to compare, including my recently restored RTX 2080 for a legacy reference. We've got 4 ultrawide resolutions to cover, including Super Ultrawide with the Super Ultrawide fix, so don't worry my 32:9 fans, I've got you covered. On top of all of that, I'm going to be showing you what preset you need to get any one of these cards to deliver 60 FPS at the resolution you choose to play at. Before we jump into the benchmarks, there's a few specifics I need to cover first, like testing area and settings that I'll be using for the testing. For choosing the test area, I cheated. That's right, I'm a cheater. I just picked what Gamers Nexus determined was the optimum test area for displaying a heavy load that wasn't uniquely extreme. Though, this did bite me in the butt a bit because it turns out old Steve, he has a faster CPU than I do. And my 5800 X3D saw some CPU bottlenecking. But fear not, I did capture some extra fully GPU bound gameplay for those cards that were affected. So those of you with top end Intel CPUs can see the kind of relative performance you can expect from these monster GPUs. As for the settings I used, I started with Ultra and turned off FSR, which turned off all the other resolution scaling related options. Then I turned FSR back on but kept dynamic resolution off. Then for high, medium, and low settings, I just let the preset as they were with dynamic resolution scaling. Now, let's benchmark this game. Starting out, we will look at our 3440 by 1440p resolution's performance with ultra settings and no FSR. Here we see the RTX 4090 on top, followed by the 7900 XT and then the 7900 XTX, all within spitting distance of each other at 71, 69, and 68 FPS. Clearly, the AMD cards are being CPU bottlenecked as there is no GPU bound scenario that would have the XT beat the XTX, and dollars to donuts the RTX 4090 is being held back as well. This means that only 3 GPUs are able to hit 60 FPS averages on an ultrawide monitor without using upscaling, as the RTX 4080 just misses out on 60 FPS. While it is possible it might be somewhat hampered by the CPU, but that's not looking too likely. If we pop on over to the 1% lows for these bottleneck cards, we see the RTX 4090 with subpar 1% low variants, while the XT and XTX are suffering greatly, as it seems that AMD driver has a high CPU overheads in this game. The rest of the Nvidia stack is seeing pretty average 1% low deviation. So, what if we got rid of the CPU bottleneck? How would things look then? Well, if we check out some spaceflight benchmarks, one of the easiest to run scenarios in this game, we see the 7900 XTX take a commanding lead with 116 FPS, followed by the 7900 XT and RTX 4090, who are neck and neck with each other at 98 and 97 FPS, and trailing behind, at an expected distance from the 4090, we have the RTX 4080 with 78 FPS. Now, across the board, 1% low scaling is very solid. With FSR on, we see the 7900 XTX get minimal scaling to only 120 FPS, as it likely hits a CPU limit, while the 7900 XT and the RTX 4090 are scaling well and closing the gap on the 7900 XTX, getting 112 and 107 FPS. The RTX 4080 scales well, but stays well behind the other two cards. So back to the cards that are not GPU limited, we see the RTX 4070 Ti round its way up into acceptable performance with a 45 FPS average, and the RTX 4070 dip into unacceptable frame rates. Our poor old RTX 2080 is struggling with only 23 FPS. When we turn on Ultra FSR, we see the 4090 pick up 4 FPS, while the 7900s get virtually no help picking up 1 FPS each. The RTX 4080 rockets up to match the AMD cards with a 68 FPS average. The RTX 4070 Ti reaches further into acceptable territory with a 51 FPS average, and the 4070 crosses the line to acceptable with 49 FPS, but the 2080 can't even hit 30. So that's 4 games that can hit 60 at the Ultra preset. And if we turn on high settings, we see a massive leap for the 4070 Ti, with both it and the 4070 getting over 60 FPS, with 74 and 63 FPS respectively. The RTX 2080 finally manages to clear 30, so that's 2 more games that make it over 60 at high settings. Turning on medium, we see the 2080 hit 48 FPS, and at the low preset it only gets 56 FPS, unable to make it to 60. The low preset is so ugly though I'd rather play at medium with 48 FPS than low at 56 FPS. Even though the unbound performance shows the kind of performance scaling you can get, I think the bound data here is more valuable. If I hadn't been a scrappy upstart hardware reviews channel that can't afford the absolute best, You may have walked away thinking that at these resolutions you were safe to pick up the 700 XTX or XT, or even an RTX 4090, and just drop it onto your last gen CPU and be golden. This is truly the first time I have felt that my R7 5800X 3D was not a no compromise gaming CPU. If you look at some of the great CPU performance benchmarks out there, you will see that if you want to squeeze the most out of our top 3 GPUs, then you will need at least a 7800X 3D if you're on AMD, or for Intel, a 13th gen i7 or above. Moving to our next ultrawide resolution of 3840 by 1600p, we now see the 7900 XTX on top of our no FSR charts, with the exact same performance as it got at 3440 by 1440, just beating out the RTX 4090, which slides a few FPS from its 1440p results. And 2 FPS behind that is the 7900 XT, again all clustered close together and all above 60 FPS. The RTX 4080 is alone in acceptable range, and the RTX 4070 Ti and 4070 are now both in unacceptable territory, while the 2080 struggles alone with unplayable frame rates. 1% lows are much the same as before, with the 2 AMD cards pretty much unchanged and all the Nvidia cards sliding down a bit more, with only the 4090 in acceptable range. Turning on Ultra FSR, we see the 4090 retake the top spot with 73 FPS because the 7900 XTX is CPU limited to only gaining a fraction of an FPS. The 7900 XT returns to the CPU limit as well. The RTX 4080 squeaks over the line at 63 FPS, and both the 4070 Ti and the 4070 make it to acceptable range. The RTX 2080 just misses out on 30 FPS. That's 4 GPUs that stay above 60 with the Ultra preset. Let's see what high can do for the 4070 cards. It's a mixed bag for them, with the 4070 Ti sailing across the line to 67 FPS, and the 4070 regular just 1 FPS shy. The RTX 2080 finally manages to clear 30 FPS as well. That's one more card across the line at high settings. Medium settings gets the 4070 where it needs to be, but not the 2080. Low settings does see it clear the acceptable threshold though. This resolution was enough to pull the 7900 XT average off the limiter when not using upscaling, but a better CPU is still warranted, especially with the 7900 XTX, which got identical performance to the 1440p and no advantage from FSR. The super ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 1440 is not natively supported, but I have implemented a fix so I can benchmark it for you. I will link the super ultrawide fix in the description below. It is super easy to use. You just copy a few files into the folder with the Starfield exe, and you're ready to enjoy super ultrawide gameplay. There are a couple of downsides with using a crude fix like this. One is it's a bit fisheye, and your HUD is distorted. As you can see here, the radar is no longer a perfect circle. If you don't want to use the fix, then the good news is that you will get the full 3440 by 1440p performance. No loss of frame rate like we saw with Diablo 4, which has filler options for that extra space. Now, on to the performance. Without upscaling, we see the top 3 start to separate a little bit. On top, we have the 7900 XTX at 63 FPS, followed closely by the RTX 4090 at 61 FPS, and for the first time the 7900 XT fails to hit 60, coming in with 57 FPS, now in acceptable range with the 4080, which is getting 47 FPS, making the 7900 XT still 21% faster than the 4080 for the average. The 4070 Ti falls even further back with a 35 FPS average, and the 4070 just falls short of 30. And finally, the RTX 2080 is down at 20 FPS. Peaking at the 1% lows, we see much of the same as before, with only the 4090 able to get out of the red. When we turn on Ultra FSR, we see the RTX 4090 once again top the charts, with the 7900 XTX still stuck at its CPU limit. The 7900 XT gets back over 60, and for the first time, the RTX 4080 fails to do so. The 4070 Ti can't make it out of unacceptable range, and the 4070 manages to get into an unacceptable range. The poor RTX 2080 is still stuck at unplayable levels. Only our top 3 cards manage to stick the landing at ultra settings. Moving to high settings, we see the RTX 4080 clear 60 and match the 4090's frame rate. Both the 4070 cards get to acceptable frame rates, and the RTX 2080 clears 30 FPS. High settings manages to get one more card across the line, so let's see what medium can do. At medium settings, the 4070 Ti clears 60, but its little brother falls just 2 FPS short, and the RTX 2080 can't quite make it to the next performance level either. One more card across the line, and at low settings we managed to get the 4070 above 60, and the 2080 to acceptable range. Even with this resolution, the 7900 XT is still not fully uncapped from its CPU limits, and both the 7900 cards are still seeing much worse 1% low scaling than compared to what we saw with our low CPU usage spaceflight benchmarks. Moving on to our final ultrawide resolution of 5120 by 2160p, when not using upscaling, we finally see the 7900 XTX and the 4090 fail to hit 60 with only 52 and 50 FPS respectively. The 7900 XT manages to round its way up into acceptable range, while the RTX 4080 is a fair bit lower in unacceptable range. The 4070 Ti and 4070 and the 4080 are all suffering with unplayable frame rates. Looking at the 1% lows, we see the 7900 XTX is within 1 FPS of its 3440 by 1440p results, still suffering from a lack of CPU power. Everything else has slid its way down a few FPS. Let's see where we land when we turn on Ultra FSR. For the first time, we see the 7900 XTX manage to hang on to the top spot when FSR is turned on with a 64 FPS average, while the RTX 4090 slides in right behind it at 62 FPS. This is the first resolution that the 7900 XT can't hit 60 when ultra settings are used, getting only 57 FPS. The 4080 managed to join it in acceptable range. The two 4070 cards managed to get themselves out of unplayable range, leaving only the 2080 down there. This leaves only 2 cards able to hit 60 at ultra settings. High settings see the 700 XT leap over the line, with the RTX 4080 coming up right behind it, with 70 and 63 FPS averages. The 4070 Ti comes close, but not quite making it all the way. The 4070 just clears the acceptable gameplay mark, and the 2080 manages to hit 30. High settings gets 2 more cards to where they need to be, and when we turn on medium settings, we see both the 4070 Ti and the 4070 make it to 60, leaving only the RTX 2080 behind. Even low settings can't get the 2080 to acceptable range at this resolution. The eagle-eyed viewers among you may have noticed that the 4070s both got 2 FPS more at medium settings than the previous resolution. I have a theory as to why. I believe the 5120 by 2160 resolution was enough to get these cards to still dip below 30 briefly, activating the dynamic resolution setting, lowering their native render resolution even further, giving these cards a tiny boost. They just happened to fall into the Goldilocks range to get that boost, where the RTX 4080 was too fast to hit 30 and see the benefit, and the 2080 is so slow that it's always using DRS, so it sees no relative boost. Beyond that, at this resolution, the 7900 cards 1% lows do still seem to be affected by the CPU overhead issues, especially when compared to how their 1% lows performed with the low CPU usage environment, and compared to what Steve at Gamers Nexus saw in his testing, where every card was a pretty consistent 1% low deviation, regardless of brand. AMD really spent their time well with this partnership, getting their GPUs to relative performance levels way above their pay grade. This game really shows that the CPU cannot be ignored when going for maximum performance. Not even the last generation best gaming CPU can prevent bottlenecking at 3440 by 1440p in CPU heavy areas, especially on the AMD cards, which seem to have more CPU driver overhead than the Nvidia cards. But in low CPU usage areas, they fly with amazing 1% lows. If you're looking to upgrade your PC to play Starfield, and your CPU doesn't currently greatly outclass your GPU, then you're probably looking at a full system upgrade to get the performance you want. If your CPU is up to the task, then Team Red is making an unignorable argument for picking them for a game that is likely to be many people's everything game. Everything was tested on my test bench featuring an AMD R7 5800X 3D with 32GB of 3200Hz CL14 memory on Windows 11 running the latest AMD and Nvidia drivers. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy Ultrawide content, please like and subscribe. If you want to see more games that I've tested, please check out this playlist here. If you want to see how these overachieving AMD GPUs do in other games, then you can check out these videos here. If you want to show this channel some love and help me buy more GPUs for testing, then you can use one of my affiliate links in the description below to buy any of these GPUs. Or you can sign up to my Patreon, or hit me up with a super. I'm Scott, and I'll see you next time, Ultrawide fans.